This is Here, the Happiest People on Earth, Chapter 2, titled Union Pacific Avenue. Although my parents moved to Downey when I was 8 months old, they continued to attend the little church on Gless Street. Dad said it was from their churches that Armenians drew their strength. Dad taught me 2 skills at about the same time. As soon as my hands were big enough, he taught me how to milk. And as soon as I was tall enough to stand on an orange crate and reach Jack's head, he showed me how to harness up. Some of my earliest memories are of hitching Jack to the buggy and setting out with the family. By now I had 2 sisters, Ruth and Lucy, for church. The trip still took 3 hours each way, and the service with the midday meal lasted 5, and I enjoyed every bit of it. I liked to watch those muscular farmers and day laborers thrusting their hands into the air as the Spirit swept the meeting, faces raised heavenward until their long black beards pointed straight out, parallel to the top of the table. I loved to hear their deep, rich voices chanting the ancient Armenian Psalter. Even the sermons were enthralling, because then the past sprang to life there in the little frame building on Gless Street. Armenia, the preacher would remind us, is the oldest Christian nation in the world, and also the one which has suffered most for her faith. The recent Turkish massacres were only the latest in a record of savage attempts by her neighbors to annihilate the small, stubborn country, and by constant retelling our history became bone and fiber of us all. It is the year 287, the preacher would begin, and young St. Gregory is wondering if he dares return home to his beloved Armenia. Gregory had fallen out of favor with the king and been exiled from the country. But in exile, he has heard the Christian message. At last, in spite of the risk, he decides to come back to share the gospel with his countrymen. The king soon learns of his return, has him seized and thrown into the deepest dungeon of the castle to die of starvation. But not before the king's sister has listened to Gregory's preaching and become a believer. The preacher would paint a vivid picture of the young woman stealing down dank stone stairs to the black, foul-smelling dungeon, hiding a loaf of bread or a gourd of goat's milk beneath her rippling cloak. For 14 years she manages to keep the saint alive. At that point, a dreadful malady seizes the king, a strange insanity that hurls him to the floor, grunting like an animal. During his lucid moments, he beseeches his physicians to heal him, but no one can. The man named Gregory could help you, his sister suggests. Gregory died many years ago, the king retorts. His bones are rotting beneath this very castle. He is alive, she says softly, and describes her 14-year vigil. So Gregory is brought from the dungeon. His hair is white as the snow on Mount Ararat, but sound in mind and spirit. In the name of Jesus Christ, he rebukes the demon tormenting the king, and in that instant the king is healed. Together, in the year 301, he and St. Gregory set out to achieve the conversion of all Armenia. On the long ride home, I would relive the story again, the patient man in the dark dungeon, locked away as year follows year, never losing faith, never losing hope, waiting only for God's perfect time. When the last of her 6 daughters married, grandmother came to live with us in the little plank house. I remember her well, a tiny white-haired woman whose dark eyes shone with pride in her only son. Her only regret, she used to say, was that Grandfather Damos had not lived to see the Shakarians back again on land of their own. Gulisard died there in that little cabin, a happy and fulfilled woman. Already, by the time I was 10, the dairy was prospering. 3 cows had become 30, then 100, then 500, and the original 10 acres had grown to 200. Dad dreamed now of owning the largest and finest dairy farm in California. If work was what it took to do that, then it might just happen too, for Dad knew how to work, and to see that the rest of us worked too. Besides myself, there was now a bunkhouse full of Mexican Americans working alongside us in the barns, and Dad and I had learned to speak Spanish. I don't know who enjoyed the others' stories more, their tales about Mexico or Dad's recollections of life in Armenia. They couldn't hear often enough about Ephraim, the boy prophet, or how Magardich Mushigan had foretold Dad's birth. Every time a new hand joined us, Dad had to tell the stories all over again. Afterwards, he'd always have to describe Ephem's funeral in 1915, the largest one in the Los Angeles Flats had ever seen. The largest one the Los Angeles Flats had ever seen. Ephem had not attended the Glass Street Church, where the service were in Armenian, but the Russian language church a few blocks away. On the date of the great funeral, not only those two congregations joined together, but even Orthodox Armenians and Russians swallowed their objections to wild Pentecostal goings-on and attended the service, for many of them, too, had come to America as a result of his prophecy. And what about the second prophecy, the Mexican Americans would ask? The one that's still to happen. It's still being safeguarded. Ephem's sons have it. And you die if you open it, unless you are the one appointed by the Lord. Who do you think that's going to be? But of course, no one knew the answer to that. It was about the time of the boy prophet's death that I got the injury which was to cause me so many problems. I never even knew how I broke my nose. A 10-year-old boy working around a farm gets a good many bumps. In any case, when I began to notice that I wasn't hearing as well as the other kids in the 5th grade, Mother took me to the doctor. I can tell you what the trouble is, Zaruhi, the doctor said, but not what to do about it. Demos has broken his nose and it's healed wrong. Both the nasal passage and the ear canals are blocked. We can try an operation, but they aren't usually too successful. And they weren't successful in my case either. Every year, it seemed, I went into the hospital for another operation, and every year the ear canals closed up again. In school, I had to sit in the very first row in order to hear the teacher at all. Although I never knew a time when Jesus wasn't a close friend, during these months when my deafness was growing worse, he seemed closer than ever. I could no longer take part in the team games the other boys played after school. Don't choose Demos. He can't hear too good. So I was alone a lot. I didn't especially mind. My favorite chore on the farm was to weed the corn because then I could go far in the fields and talk to the Lord out loud. The summers when I was 12 and 13, the long dim aisles seemed to me like a green cathedral, the great veined leaves arching overhead. There I would lift my hands in the air the way the men did at church. Let me hear again, Jesus. Don't listen to what the doctor says about not getting better. How well I remember every detail of that Sunday in 1926 when I was 13. I recall getting up and dressing in my room on the 2nd floor of our new home. Dad had 1,000 head of milk cows now and had built a 2-story Spanish-style house with white stucco walls and a red tile roof. I felt funny as I dressed for church, funny in a nice way, as if my whole body were in some sort of special spiritual tune. I went down the long curved staircase to breakfast singing. My parents and sisters were already at the table. By now, 3 more little girls had joined the family. The youngest, Florence, was still a baby of 2. But the 4 older girls were chattering excitedly about our weekly trip to town. I tried to join in, but soon gave up. How could you talk to people who mumbled? Our old horse, Jack, no longer pulled the family buggy 15 miles into church each Sunday. The year before, when Jack reached 16, Dad had put him out to pasture to spend the rest of his life in well-deserved retirement. In his place, we now had a long black Studebaker touring car with a canvas top and a box of spare axles beneath the back seat for the uneven farm roads. That Sunday, the little church hummed with excitement. There was not a person in the room who did not remember what had happened last week. The mother of one of the women in the congregation had left Armenia 2 months before to join her daughter in America. There had been no word from her since, and the daughter was frantic. As the church had begun to pray about the situation, Aunt Esther's husband, Uncle George Stepanian, suddenly got up and strode to the door. For a long time he stood staring up the street, as though seeing far horizons. At last he spoke. "Your mother is fine," he said. "She will be in Los Angeles in 3 days." 3 days later, the old lady arrived. And so today, the sense of expectancy was high, each one wondering what form the Lord's next blessing would take. Perhaps someone would be healed. Perhaps someone would receive guidance. Even as I was thinking this, a strange thing began to happen. Not to someone else, but to me. As I sat there on a rear bench with the other boys, I felt something like a heavy woolen blanket settle over my shoulders. I looked around, startled, but no one had touched me. I tried to move my arms, but they met resistance, like I was pulling them through water. Suddenly, my jaw began to shake as if I were shivering with cold, although the blanket felt warm. The muscles in the back of my throat tightened. I had a sudden yearning to tell Jesus that I loved him, but when I opened my mouth to say so, out came words I couldn't understand. I knew they weren't Armenian or Spanish or English, but they poured out of me as though I'd been speaking them all my life. I turned to the boy next to me, and he was all grins. "Deimos has got the spirit," he shouted, and all over the church people turned. Someone asked me a question, but though I understood him perfectly, I could only in the bubbling, joyous new sounds. The whole church began to sing and praise God in delight while I worshiped the Lord in my new language. Even hours later, driving home in the car, anyone who spoke to me was answered in tongues. I went upstairs to my room and closed the door, and still the ecstatic, unintelligible syllables spilled out of me. I put on my pajamas and turned out the light, and at that moment the sense of the Lord's presence came over me more strongly than ever. It was as if the invisible mantle, which had remained on my shoulders all evening, had become irresistibly heavy, though not unpleasantly so. I sank to the floor and lay there on the rug, absolutely helpless, unable to get up and get into bed. It was not a frightening experience, but a wholesome and refreshing one, like the special moment just before you fall into a deep sleep. As I lay there in my room, time took on an eternal quality, and in that eternity I heard a voice. It was one I recognized very well indeed, for I heard it often in my green cathedral out in the cornfields. "Deimos, can you sit up?" it asked. I tried, but it was useless. Some incredibly strong yet infinitely gentle power held me where I was. I knew that I was a strong boy, not as strong as a ram Mushigan, but very tough indeed for a 13-year-old. Yet my muscles had no more strength than a newborn calf's. The voice was speaking again. "Deimos, will you ever doubt my power?" "No, Lord Jesus." 3 times the question was repeated. 3 times I answered it. Then, all at once, the power which had been all around me seemed to be inside as well. I felt a surge of superhuman energy, as if I could float right out of the house and sail the heavens in the power of God. I felt as if I could look down on earth from God's perspective, see all human need from the vantage point of his supply. And all the while he was whispering to my heart, "Deimos, power is the birthright of every Christian. Accept power, Deimos." And suddenly it was dawn. I could hear the mockingbirds outside my window. I sat up with a start. I could hear what? It had been years since I had heard a bird singing. I jumped to my feet, feeling wonderfully whole and alive, and scrambling into my clothes. It was 5 a.m., and Dad and I had to be in the milking barns by 5:30. As I opened my door that marvelous morning, I could hear the eggs sizzling down in the kitchen, the click of dishes, the songs of birds, the clatter of my own feet as I raced down the red tile staircase. These were the little sounds I had not realized I was missing. I burst into the kitchen. "Dad, Mother, I can hear!" The healing was never total. When Mother and I returned to the doctor, he discovered 90% of normal hearing. Why I was left with the 10% impairment, I don't know, and I don't worry about it. I remember later that same Monday morning when the milking was finished, going alone to my green cathedral. The corn was high, ready for harvest. I sat down between 2 rows, snapped off an ear, shucked it, and nibbled at the white grains popping with milk. "Lord," I said, "I know that when you heal people, it's because you have work for them to do. Will you show me, Lord, the job you have for me?" At first, as the other boys in my class dreamed of becoming baseball stars, I dreamed of becoming a prophet. I was, after all, just a little older than the boy prophet had been when he had his vision. But the years passed, and I did not receive this wonderful gift. "Prophecy will play a large part in your life," the Lord seemed to be saying, "but you will not be a prophet." Then one day I had an experience which made me wonder whether I was to become a healer. My youngest sister Florence was 6 years old when she fell against a stanchion pipe out in the barn and shattered her right elbow. By the time the surgeon and the bone specialist had finished their work, they were confident that Florence would retain the use of her hand, but the elbow would forever remain bent and rigid. When the cast comes off, we can begin the therapy. With patience, she may regain 10, even 20% articulation, but that's the best we can hope for. One Sunday in church, soon after this report, I felt again the sensation of a warm, heavy blanket settling over my shoulders. I did not need to ask who it was, nor did I question what I should do. I was to step across the room and pray for the healing of Florence's arm. So while everyone was singing a hymn, I got up quietly from my bench and walked over to the women's section. I leaned down to Florence, sitting on the last bench, her right arm encased in a huge plaster cast. The warmth of the blanket spread down my arms and into my hands. "Florence," I whispered, "I'm going to pray for your elbow." Her large black eyes regarded me solemnly. I placed my hands on the cast. Actually, I hardly prayed at all, but just stood there, feeling the fire flood down my arms and hands into the plaster around Florence's elbow. "I feel that," Florence whispered. "It feels hot." And that was all. In a moment, the sensation of the mantle left me, and I returned to my seat. I doubt if half a dozen people had noticed us. A few weeks later, the cast came off. At dinner that evening, Mother told us how the specialist had put one hand on the white creased skin of Florence's elbow, taken her wrist with the other, and gingerly attempted to straighten the injured arm an inch or two. As the forearm swung all the way back, then forward, then in wide circles from the elbow, his face broke into an incredulous smile. "Well," he kept saying, "well, better than I expected. Much better. Why, it's like an arm that has never been broken, that never was broken." And so, out in the cornfield that summer, I found myself asking the Lord if healing was his work for me. Again, I seemed to get an answer. Of course, I want all my church to do this work, but you'll see many wonderful healings, some through your own hands. But Damos, this is not my special work for you either. I was 17 and a sophomore in high school. I could have been a senior, but I had lost 2 years because of my deafness. When Dad bought a second farm, we had room now to erect our own silos and enough capital to install automatic milking machines. He was getting into another business as well. A big headache for us and our neighboring dairy farmers had always been getting our milk from farm to bottling plant. So Dad started a milk haulage business. Then, noting that the price of ham was up in L.A., Dad also got into hog raising, and then into meat packing. "The Lord will command the blessing upon you in all that you undertake." It seemed indeed that everything Isaac, son of promise, touched was destined to thrive. His success was all the more remarkable because these were the depression years of the early 30s. By now, Dad had given me my own small herd to manage, and I remember the teacher who helped me set up bookkeeping records, informing me wistfully that I was making more with my 30 cows than most of the teachers at Downey High. To our home now gravitated politicians, businessmen, community leaders, and my mother. The shy little immigrant girl from Armenia found herself hostessing weekly dinner parties for the powerful and prominent. She was a truly marvelous cook, and soon her dolmas, kuftas, and katas were famous all over Southern California. But what I chiefly remember about Mother's cooking was that she took the same pains no matter who the guest. Tramps were frequent callers in those days, and they got the same treatment as the Mayor Downey. The best china, the silver knives and forks, a cloth on the table. If no hot meal was ready, she would prepare one. Meat, vegetables, homemade pastry, all the while urging the man in her limited English, "Sit, sit, no hurry for eat." And meanwhile, I found myself drawn more and more often to another address. Whenever business for the farm took me to East Los Angeles, I would find an excuse to wander past Sorokin Gabrielian's rambling cream-colored home at 4311 Union Pacific Avenue, in the hopes that his daughter might suddenly appear in the yard. Not that I could have spoken to her if she had. Boy-girl conversations, unless the two were engaged, were still unheard of in the Armenian community. But just knowing that she was close by filled me with an indescribable happiness. And always there was Sunday to look forward to. Sunday when Rose Gabrielian would be sitting with the other girls on the women's side of the church, the prettiest girl in the room, the one all the boys surreptitiously followed with their eyes. Her father's first name, Sorokin, meant sweetheart in Armenian. I liked that. Like my own father, Sorokin Gabrielian had started out with nothing. Eventually, he had scraped together $100 and, also like Dad, bought a horse and wagon. Sorokin, however, instead of hauling fruits and vegetables with his rig, went into the trash collection business. It was a much-needed service in Los Angeles just after the turn of the century, and soon he was able to buy a second house and cart. a second horse and cart, then a third. Sorokin and his family were Armenian Orthodox. He lived near the Gles Street Church, however, and hearing the joyous sounds which poured from the open windows week after week, he decided to investigate. Before long, he joined the congregation and very nearly lost his life. To many Orthodox Armenians, the Pentecostals seemed like traitors to the ancient faith. To see one of their own join this hated group was the same as seeing him dead, so they decided to bury him. One day, when Sorokin pulled up to the city dump with his load of refuse, a gang of Orthodox believers was waiting for him. They pinioned his arms and legs and carried him to a pit they had dug in the sandy soil. They had thrown him into it and actually had several feet of dirt on top of him when a wagon driven by the Pentecostals arrived, and in the free-for-all which followed, Sorokin scrambled out. I love to hear him tell that story. I also like to hear him tell about his marriage. When Sorokin was 21, his father had decided to return to Armenia in search of a wife, Sorokin's mother having died some years before. Sorokin's trash business was thriving by then, so he asked his father to bring back a bride for him as well. Sorokin's father was successful in both quests. For his son, he had chosen a pretty 13-year-old named Tarun Mardarosian to facilitate her entry into the United States. She was married by proxy there in Armenia, then set out on the long journey to join the husband she had never seen. Only later did they realize how providential the timing was. A few weeks later, the Turks attacked that section of Armenia. The two brides were the last people to leave their village alive. Tarun's welcome to Los Angeles must have been one of the strangest so young a wife ever experienced. Sorokin had not expected his father and the two women until the following day. He returned from the city dump to find a terrified-looking child standing in the living room. With a start, he realized that this must be his wife, and that he himself was covered with dirt and grime from head to toe. "Stay there," he shouted at her. "Stay right there," as though the poor girl had anywhere else to go. He bolted for the rear of the house, and half an hour later, scrubbed, brushed, and scented within an inch of his life, Sorokin's sweetheart Gabrielian made his formal speech of greeting to a very relieved young lady. These were Rose's parents, the ones who would someday soon be choosing a husband for her, but I could never approach them directly with a request to marry their daughter. In my case, as in hers, it was the family which must act. How I trembled the night I broached the subject with mine. It was a June evening in 1932, and we were all seated around the dining room table, the porch doors open to the breeze. "Dad, you know I'm 19 now," I began. Dad wiped his mustache and cut another piece of beef. "And," I pressed on, "I'm about to graduate from high school, and I'm helping to make the farms pay, and you were 19 when you got married." My 5 sisters all stopped eating. Mother laid down her fork. "There was a particular girl?" she asked. "Yes." "Was she an Armenian?" "Yes." "Then she was Christian?" "Oh, yes." I began. It's Rose Gabrielian." "Ah," said Mother. "So," said Dad. "Oh," said all my sisters at once. And so began the elaborate centuries-old process of making a proposal of marriage. First, although the families saw one another every week at church and were close friends, an official meeting must be arranged. This delicate matter was always handled by a carefully selected go-between. After much discussion between them, I was not consulted, of course, Mother and Dad agreed that the proper person for this sensitive task was Raphael Genoian, the husband of Dad's sister, Sarun. A good omen, I told myself, for of the 6 men who had married Dad's 6 sisters, Uncle Genoian was my favorite. He owned a large junkyard where, when I was 14, he let me rummage for the old car parts with which I'd built my first automobile, and this junkyard put him in daily contact with Gabrielian's refuse hauling company. I remember how I ran to meet his car as it turned into our driveway after his formal call on Sorokin Gabrielian. But Uncle Genoian was not going to discharge his trust so lightly. He proceeded to our living room with great deliberateness, accepted a cup of strong sweet tea, and stirred it lengthily. "Well, Raphael?" Dad prompted. "Well, Isaac," Uncle Genoian returned. "A date has been agreed upon. The Gabrielians will be delighted to receive a visit from the Shakirians on the 20th of next month." "A visit agreed to!" Then, at least, they had not rejected my suit automatically, and that must mean that that at any rate she was willing to consider me. My head swam with the thought. At last, the 20th of July arrived. I finished my chores in the barn in record time and started to make ready. I bathed and showered and bathed again. I brushed my teeth until the enamel was loose. I used Listerine and Levoris both. I scrubbed my farm dirty nails till the bristles came off the brush. I heard Dad back the Packard out of the garage. One last dash up the tile stairs to get a scuff mark off my shoe and dab extra styptic on the place where I'd nicked myself on the third shave. "Damos," Dad roared from the driveway. "What are you trying to do? Be prettier than Rose?" Wedged between my sisters in the back seat, I thought the 17 miles between Downey and East Los Angeles had never seemed so long. At last we pulled up at 4311 Union Pacific. Up the gravel walk we trooped, past Tarun Gabriellian's neat rows of basil, parsley, and other kitchen herbs. The front door swung open, and there they all stood. Sorokin and Tarun, Rose's older brother Edward, uncles and great aunts and cousins without number, and behind them all, Rose in a summer dress the color of her name. I didn't have long to gaze at her, for the gathering group broke up at once, Armenian fashion, into mutually exclusive groups, the men on one side of the large living room, the women on the other. Occasionally I would look over to where Rose was sitting with my sisters and wonder what girls talked about. Rose was the same age as my sister Lucy. I wondered if I would ever talk to Rose as naturally and easily as Lucy was doing. Nor did I take any part in the solemn conversation going on in two overstuffed chairs drawn close together between my father and Sorokin Gabriellian. Whatever passed between them, both men seemed satisfied. At the door, Mr. Gabriellian said to Dad, I will relay your messages to Rose." And 2 weeks later, Uncle Genoian delivered the momentous answer: Rose would marry me. Now came the 5 traditional nights of celebration at the bride's home for an answer of yes. They were joyous evenings of singing, eating, speech-making, and mutual congratulations, for among Armenians it is not 2 individuals, but 2 families who marry each other. One evening, Rose gave us a concert at the piano, and my heart swelled with pride to watch her fingers flying so swiftly over the keys. I had once taken violin lessons, but had stopped by mutual agreement, and my teacher, myself, and everyone within hearing range. Florence had inherited both the violin and the lessons, and she too played for the assembled families. 8 years old, her supple right arm crooked lovingly over the gleaming wood. Another night came the giving of the token, the customary gift from the boy to the girl, symbolizing the new relationship. In this case, it was a wristwatch set with diamonds. The gift had been chosen, again by my parents, but to me fell the task of crossing the room to where the ladies sat and fastening the watch around Rose's wrist. In the sudden silence, with every eye in the room upon me, my fingers turned to wood. First, I couldn't get the tiny clasp open. Then I couldn't get it shut. I thought longingly of the tractor shed where I could take a piece of machinery apart and put it together without a second thought. At last Rose reached over with her right hand and deftly fastened it for me. And of course there were decisions for our elders to make, such as where the wedding would be held and when. The church on Gillespie Street, all agreed, was far too small for the hundreds who would be coming, and besides, Orthodox friends and family would die rather than set foot there. No, the wedding would be at the groom's home, old country fashion, and the feast which would follow, and which was, of course, the central event of any Armenian milestone, would be held in the big double tennis courts in the backyard. As to the date, the Gabriellians were adamant on waiting at least a year. Times had changed, they explained, since my mother had married at 15 and Rose's mother at 13. A woman needed maturity to raise a family these days. We must wait until Rose was 16. And, all the while, as our affairs were discussed and decisions about our futures made, Rose and I had yet to speak our first words to each other. Traditionally, that moment would come only after the formal engagement party to which more distant relatives and friends would be invited, these family get-togethers being preliminaries only. But by the 4th night of celebration, I could stand it no longer. Throwing tradition to the winds, I sprang to my feet. "Mrs. Gabrielian," I said across the expanse of heads, "may I speak to Rose?" For a horrified moment, Tarun Gabrielian stared at me in silence. Then, with a shake of her head and that head that asked what the younger generation was coming to, she led Rose and me into another room, placed 2 straight-back chairs side by side in the center of the floor, and went out, leaving us alone. For the first time in our lives, and suddenly all the fine speeches I had rehearsed deserted me. I had planned masterpieces of feeling and expression in my very best Armenian because Sorokin Gabrielian, alarmed by the new Hollywood madness of the city, would permit no English spoken under his roof. I intended to tell her that she was the most beautiful girl in the world and that I would spend my life trying to make her happy. But I couldn't remember a word, and I sat there tongue-tied and stupid. At last, to my horror, the words I blurted out were, "Rose, I know God wants us together." To my astonishment, her glowing brown eyes filled with tears. "Deimos," she whispered, "all my life I've prayed that the man I married would say those words to me first of all." 3 weeks later came the official engagement party when the bride received the ring. We went together to a wholesale diamond house to pick it out, accompanied, of course, by a large contingent of family. The sales lady's name, I still remember, was Mrs. Earhart. We talked about her daughter Amelia, who had just flown alone across the Atlantic Ocean. I caught Rose looking wistfully at a lovely small diamond on one of the trays, but my mother chose a different one. It never occurred to either of us to question her decision. The engagement party was a sit-down dinner for 300, held in a grocery store owned by the Gabrielians. After this, it was permissible for me to call on Rose as often as I liked, which was every night I wasn't working, usually bearing Mother's buttery, diamond-shaped baklava or shakar lakum. As the long year passed, Mother, Rose, and my sisters went shopping oftener and oftener. By tradition, the groom's family buys the wardrobe for the bride, and selecting a handbag or a hat could take half a dozen excursions. Rose's favorite purchase was a dark maroon dress with matching shoes. In the Armenian community, only married women wore dark clothes. Rose was convinced she would look 5 years older the minute she put them on. The wedding took place August 6, 1933. That morning, the entire Shakarian clan drove into East Los Angeles to bring the bride home. Since the main meal of the day was to be in the evening, the Gabrielians served only a 5-course luncheon, a mere snack by Armenian standards. Then both families set out for Downey in a flower-decked caravan of 25 cars. At home, the fence around the tennis courts had vanished beneath cascades of roses. Of the rest of the day, I recall only isolated moments. Pastor Peramian's long, light brown beard bobbing up and down as he read the ancient Armenian service. Strings of electric light bulbs looped between the palm trees, and white-jacketed waiters struggling under tremendous platters of shish kebab and the traditional Dayton almond wedding pilaf, which Mother had been preparing for days. I do remember that there were 500 guests, and every one of them, it seemed, had written a poem in Armenian, which must be heard and applauded by the entire gathering. By 11 p.m., I was dizzy with fatigue, and there were tears in Rose's eyes because she'd had on her white tight shoes since morning. But as we stood in the endless receiving line saying good night to friends and family, we were sure of one thing. Rose and I were finally, thoroughly, irrevocably, permanently married, in the most Armenian sense of the word.